On the evening of May 30th, 1942, the calm of the English countryside was deceptive. At Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence, a dinner was underway, one that would quietly shape the course of the air war. Seated among the guests was Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Travers Harris, known to his men and to history as Bomber Harris. Broad-shouldered, red-haired, and uncompromising, Harris spoke with conviction about the one weapon Britain could wield against the heart of Nazi Germany, the bomber. As plates were cleared and cigars lit, Harris explained his belief that relentless strategic bombing could break the German war machine without another trench war in Europe. Across the table, Winston Churchill listened intently. The Prime Minister, ever aware of Britain's limited ground power, had already declared, "There is only one sure path to victory, an absolutely devastating, exterminating attack by very heavy bombers upon the Nazi homeland." Churchill had found his man. Harris had found his mission. For 2 years, Britain had endured the blitz nights of sirens, fire, and ruin. Now, Harris was determined to repay the enemy in kind, but he sought not revenge, rather proof that air power alone could shorten the war. The Americans were arriving, led by General Henry Hap Arnold, ready to join the skies above Europe. Harris wanted to show them what the Royal Air Force could do. As the evening wound down, he sat in quiet thought, planning what would become the most daring gamble of his career. He called it Operation Millennium, a single massive raid that would send 1,000 bombers against a single German city. A strike not just of destruction, but of demonstration, to prove to allies and skeptics alike that the bomber could indeed be the weapon to bring Hitler's empire to its knees. In the days leading up to the raid, the corridors of Bomber Command buzzed with tension. Operation Millennium, the bold plan to send 1,000 bombers against a single German city, was unlike anything the world had ever attempted. Air Chief Marshal Harris knew that success or failure would define not only his command, but the very future of the Allied air war. At his side was his loyal deputy, Air Marshal Sir Robert Sonby, a meticulous planner with a quiet mind for detail. Together, they scoured the numbers. Bomber Command had only 416 first-line aircraft, nowhere near enough for the scale Harris envisioned. But through careful coordination, he pulled aircraft from training units, conversion squadrons, and reserve bases. Every plane that could fly would fly. When the final count came in, it read 1,046 bombers. The chosen target, Cologne, one of Germany's oldest and most industrialized cities, home to its chemical and machine tool industries, and a symbol of strength on the River Rhine. The planning was precise. Crews were briefed on routes, altitudes, and timing. Ground personnel worked around the clock, preparing aircraft under floodlights that turned English airfields into seas of silver. When Churchill asked, "How many are you going to lose?" Harris replied calmly, "Say 50 aircraft and crews." The Prime Minister nodded, his tone heavy. "Then I shall be prepared for the loss of 100. But Harris believed his men would prevail. His strategy was daring, an unbroken stream of bombers over the target for 90 minutes. So dense, he said, that the Germans would not have time to recover between waves. The weather, however, threatened to ruin it all. Twice, the operation was postponed as rain and clouds covered Europe. But time was running out, morale was at stake, and the Americans were watching. Then came the report. Conditions would be uncertain, yet there was a chance the skies above Cologne might clear by midnight. It was not ideal, but Harris made his decision. "Tonight," he said quietly, "we go." Across 53 airfields in Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, and East Anglia, more than 6,000 young men prepared to take flight into the unknown, many for the last time. As twilight faded over the English countryside on May 30th, 1942, the calm hum of preparation spread across the airfields of Bomber Command. From Lincolnshire to East Anglia, engines growled to life beneath a pale moon. Mechanics made final checks, ground crews tightened bolts with cold, oil-stained hands, and pilots stood quietly beside their aircraft, their breath visible in the cool night air. At exactly 10:30 p.m., the first green signal flares streaked upward. One by one, the bombers began to roll. Across 53 runways, the thunder of engines rose until the night itself seemed to vibrate. The first aircraft to lift into the darkness were the Pathfinder's twin-engined Wellingtons and the great four-engined Stirlings. They were followed, in perfect sequence, by the main body: Halifaxes, Hampdens, Manchesters, and the new Lancasters, sleek, black shapes climbing toward the stars. Each plane carried its maximum load of high explosives and incendiaries, packed into narrow bomb bays and stacked along the fuselage. Inside the cockpits, the crew's young men, most barely 20, checked their compasses and oxygen masks, eyes fixed on the instruments glowing dim green. Over the North Sea, the vast formation stretched for miles. Beneath them, only moonlit clouds. 100 aircraft were forced to turn back, plagued by mechanical failure or icing, but the rest pressed on eastward, toward occupied Holland and beyond. In his operations room, Harris watched the progress signals flicker in on his chart. He knew what was at stake. If the mission failed, critics would call it reckless. If it succeeded, it could change the course of the air war. Over the Dutch coast, the sky remained heavy with cloud. The men could see nothing below, no towns, no rivers, only pale mist and darkness. Yet still they flew, engines droning in endless rhythm, their silhouettes invisible to one another, except for the faint flicker of exhaust flames. Somewhere far ahead, the Rhine waited, and beyond it, the ancient city of Cologne. As the clock neared midnight, the first wave descended toward the target. The gamble was in motion. The world's largest air armada was about to test the limits of courage, technology, and fate, all in a single night. Shortly before midnight, the cloud cover that had shrouded Germany began to break. As the bombers crossed the Rhine, moonlight spilled through, revealing the dark outline of Cologne below. The twin spires of the city's great cathedral rose above the skyline, a landmark visible for miles. For the men in the lead aircraft, it was both a target and a warning. They were deep inside enemy airspace now. At 12:47 a.m., the first flares were released. Pathfinders marked the aiming point near the Neumarkt district, the heart of the old city. Seconds later, the first Stirling bomber opened its bomb bay. A torrent of incendiaries rained downward, streaking through the night like molten comets. Within moments, orange flames began to bloom across rooftops. The air raid sirens wailed. On the ground, thousands of citizens hurried into shelters as anti-aircraft guns roared to life. 500 flak batteries ringed the city, filling the sky with bursting shells. Yet the bombers came on wave after wave, a stream so dense it seemed unending. Searchlights clawed at the heavens, sweeping across the clouds, catching one aircraft after another in their blinding beams. The gunners of the Luftwaffe's 88mm batteries fired continuously, shaking the city with thunder. One by one, bombers were hit engines, trailing smoke, wings ablaze, spiraling down toward the inferno below. But still they came. The Wellingtons, the Halifaxes, the Manchesters, the mighty Lancasters flying straight through walls of fire and steel. For the next 90 minutes, the ancient city was consumed. High explosive bombs shattered streets and factories. Incendiaries turned whole districts into oceans of flame. Crews returning westward reported seeing the fire spread so far that its glow was visible from 150 miles away. By the time the last Lancaster dropped its load at 3:05 a.m., much of Cologne lay in ruins. More than 600 acres of the city were devastated. Over 3,000 houses were destroyed, 9,000 more damaged, 40 aircraft never returned. 474 civilians were dead, and more than 5,000 were injured. Yet even in the midst of the devastation, the cathedral still stood its two spires untouched, silhouetted against the red sky. To many, it was a symbol of endurance amid destruction, a silent witness to the night the war reached Cologne. As dawn approached, the surviving bombers turned for home. Behind them, the fires of Cologne still burned, casting long shadows across the Rhine. Operation Millennium, the gamble of 1,000 bombers, was complete. As dawn broke over Europe on May 31st, 1942, a pale haze of smoke still hung above the Rhine. From 20,000 feet, reconnaissance pilots of the new de Havilland Mosquitoes reported what few had believed possible. Cologne was burning from end to end. Fires still raged across the industrial districts, their smoke rising in a single dark column visible for miles. By midday, the full scale of destruction came into focus. 36 factories were crippled, 70 more had their output cut in half, and entire neighborhoods were reduced to ashes. Over 45,000 civilians were left homeless. Yet, remarkably, only 1 month's industrial production had been lost. The German machine would recover quickly, but the psychological effect was far greater than the material damage. Inside Germany, disbelief turned to fury. Albert Speer, Hitler's minister for armaments, refused to believe the early reports. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, once proud of his Luftwaffe's control of the skies, exploded when Cologne's Gauleiter telephoned him. "Impossible," he shouted. "That many bombs cannot be dropped in one night." Even Adolf Hitler, who only the day before had dismissed Britain's bombing power, raged that his commanders had failed to defend the Reich. Across the Channel, the mood was very different. In Britain, the headlines blazed with triumph. After 2.5 years of hardship, defeat, and nightly fear, the people of the island nation finally felt the balance shifting. Churchill called it a remarkable feat of organization. He telegraphed President Roosevelt, "I hope you are pleased with our mass attack on Cologne. There is plenty more to come." The raid's success reverberated far beyond London. From New York to the small towns of America, newsreels hailed the RAF's courage. Even in the Warsaw Ghetto, the news reached the imprisoned. Historian Emanuel Ringelblum wrote in his diary, "Cologne was an advance payment on the vengeance that must and shall be taken on Hitler's Germany." For Air Chief Marshal Harris, the gamble had paid off. Operation Millennium proved that concentrated, large-scale bombing could break enemy morale and shake the foundations of the Nazi war effort. And for the men of Bomber Command, exhausted, grieving their lost comrades, there was quiet pride. They had shown the world what could be done from the air. But the night over Cologne had also set a precedent, one that would define the rest of the air war and the moral questions that would follow. In the days that followed the Cologne raid, the German response was swift. On the night of May 31st, 25 enemy bombers crossed the Channel and struck the ancient city of Canterbury, a symbolic act of revenge. Fires burned in its medieval streets, yet the cathedral, like Cologne's, survived. The message was clear. The age of total war had begun. For Sir Arthur Harris, Operation Millennium was more than a success. It was validation. Churchill congratulated him personally, calling the raid a magnificent demonstration of British power. Newspapers dubbed him Bomber Harris, a name he would carry for the rest of his life. With his position secure, he pressed on, convinced that air power alone could end the war. Within days, he launched further raids on Essen, Bremen, and other industrial centers of the Ruhr. But weather and smoke often hid the targets, and the results were uneven. Losses mounted. The war in the air would not be swift nor merciful. By 1943, Bomber Command's campaign had grown into a nightly onslaught. Entire cities, Hamburg, Berlin, Kassel, were engulfed in firestorms. Thousands died beneath the waves of incendiaries and explosives. The Allies called it the destruction of German war potential. To many on the ground, it was simply devastation. Then came Dresden. In February 1945, more than 1,000 bombers turned one of Europe's most beautiful cities into a sea of flame. The firestorm killed tens of thousands, sparking an outcry that reached even into Parliament. Prime Minister Churchill, once the architect of the bombing campaign, wrote privately that the destruction of Dresden raised a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. Yet, in public, he refused to apologize. When the war ended, Harris found himself isolated, praised by his men, but shunned by politicians who had once cheered his name. He resigned in 1946, denying the peerage given to most wartime leaders. Only decades later would Britain formally honor the airmen of Bomber Command, who had lost over 72,000 of their own. In 1992, 50 years after that fateful night, a statue of Sir Arthur Harris was unveiled in London. As the ceremony ended, a Lancaster bomber, the same type that had thundered over Cologne, flew overhead in salute. The night of May 30th, 1942, had begun as a gamble, but it became a turning point. It marked the moment when air power truly came of age, when the skies themselves became the battlefield that would shape the fate of nations.